Hello, and welcome to my channel. My name is Jonathan Cohn, and today I have my book review of the novelization Star Trek Klingon. The novelization is by Dean Wesley Smith and Kristine Kathryn Rusch. The script for the CD-Rom was by Hilary Bader, and the story for the CD-Rom was by Dean Wesley Smith and Kristine Kathryn Rusch, who also did the novelization. As I mentioned, this is not a novelization of a movie or a TV show, but a novelization of a CD-ROM. Back in the 1990s, Star Trek started expanding into video games, and what they were trying to do was expand into literary video games. And so what they decided to do was start making these CD-ROM games. The first one, I believe it's the first one, is the one that was where you go on the Enterprise D and you're just exploring the ship. They just use the sets, and that's literally all you're doing in that game. Whereas this one, it tells a story about Gowron and this young Klingon, Pak, and you in the game play as Pak, and you are going to try to get vengeance, get honor for Pak's father's murder. And the novelization has that as the flashback B story, but the A story is about which is happening in 2370 during the events of DS9 and Next Generation, is about Gowron leading the Klingons as they go to DS9 to have a summit with the Federation, with people like Admiral Jellicoe, Captain Picard, Commander Riker, Commander Sisko, several other characters show up. And so during this kind of summit, and they're not getting anywhere, and so he decides to tell them a story. And so you're flashing back and forth between Gowron, who's telling the story, and then Gowron in the story. And it's really quite fascinating because they had to, in some way, keep the script from the game, which meant that they had to keep the interactive feel. And so to do that, Gowron enlists the help of Lieutenant Barclay to make the decisions in the story, even though he's recounting a historical event. So there's just a lot of fascinating behind-the-scenes aspects that just makes me really think about the book, and I just am very fascinated by the way they were able to pull this off. And they did some things in this book great, and they did some things in this book not so great. The great part of this book is the A-plot when you're following Gowron. There's people who are trying to kidnap him. There's people who are trying to murder him. There's all this Klingon politics going on. There's stuff with Riker, who's kind of flirting with Jadzia Dax in this book. There's storylines in the A-plot where you have Picard and Riker and Worf are trying to get Admiral Jellicoe to be kind to the Klingons and try to understand things from their perspective. And Gowron is telling the story to try to help Jellicoe understand Klingon culture and Klingon history and the Klingon people. And to me, all of that stuff was endlessly fascinating. There's several characters from Star Trek episodes and even characters from one of the movies that show up that are very interesting, and it provides a lot more bigness to the plot. In the original game, you're just focusing on Gowron in the B plot. There is no A plot because they could not get all the actors. You couldn't get Picard, you couldn't get Jellicoe, you couldn't get all these other big name actors because you just couldn't afford them. The video game had a very bare bones budget. But in the novel, they can do whatever you want. You're not limited to what the actors would do because you already have the license for their likeness and their characters. So because of that, they are able to expand the cast brilliantly. That's what's great about the book. However, the B plot, the one with searching for the murderers of Pak's father, it's kind of thin. There's not much to it. It's very bland. It's not. There's some cool twists in there, but it's not like this big epic storyline. It's not really impressive. So that storyline was just kind of bland. And then I really did not like the way that the authors intercut. They had to use Barclay as the person making the decisions to make it as close to the video game as possible. But when they did that, they sacrificed the momentum of the story. And so in the middle of chapters, you cut to and from the sequences back and forth, because they're telling the story. What it should have been is you should have had the stuff on on DS9 in the A plot, and then whenever the chapter would end, Gowron would say, "Let me go back to my story," and then the next chapter should just be the story, and then the next chapter you flash back and forth. But because they flash back and forth within the chapters, and in multiple times even, you're jumping in and out of the stories, it feels like you're cutting off your momentum, and it just doesn't flow well. And I don't know whether that's the author's fault because they made that decision, or whether the mandate was they needed to keep the interactive nature of the game. Whichever the case, it's disappointing to see. But if you want to see this done well, I would suggest the story Kahless by Michael Jan Friedman, which I've read a couple years ago and I loved. This is a great Star Trek book. This is a book that intercuts back and forth between Kahless, the new emperor, the clone, and the original Kahless, and it tells two stories that seemingly are separated, but they actually have some thematic ties. And this does that, as what I was talking about earlier, perfectly. Plus it adds dynamics about like epic fantasy novels, and it adds a lot of context to Klingon history and culture. And this book adds a lot of context to Klingon history and culture and characters too, but it feels, when you're reading it, it just doesn't have the right flow. And so while they're both fantastic books, and they're both similar books, I think that Kahless is a much better book, and this book is a solid 300 pages, so there's a lot of storytelling that Michael Jan Friedman was able to throw in. This book does not have that much. It's only 190 pages of story, 195 pages, so it's actually quite short. Now, there is something really cool at the end of the book. There is about a 20-page behind-the-scenes thing written by David Mack, where he talks about where the idea for the video game, the CD-ROM, came from, how pre-production worked, how they got the scripts written, how they got everything together, how production worked, what it was like on set, things like that. And then talks about post-production of you have to take the footage that you shoot and actually add in the programming to make it an actual game. And some of that stuff was fascinating, but at the end of it, I was like, all right, I just want to get done with this. So the behind-the-scenes featurette is valuable if you're someone who likes behind-the-scenes featurettes, if you're someone who's really interested in the mechanics of making video games, and also if you just loved the book that much that you just want to read more about the story. Maybe you'll enjoy that, but I don't think it's required. Like when you're reading the book, just read the actual story, the 195 pages of story. You don't need to read on the tacked on 20 pages. Although I found it fascinating, but I'm not recommending it. But I am recommending the book because it is a fascinating story, and if you understand the parameters with which the story was written, I think that you will find the design of the book fascinating. Even though I disagree with how they did the flow of the book, I think the design of the book is actually really well done. And so I actually had quite a lot of fun with this. I read it in 2 sittings. It's a really, as I said, it's a pretty short book, but it's fascinating. The business behind it is. And so I would actually give the book a 7 out of 10 for enjoyment. Very solid book. If you love Klingons are my favorite Star Trek species, so I love reading about them. So if you like Klingons, you will like this book because it's called Star Trek Klingon. And if you like DS9 and the Next Generation casts, you'll like them because they're present here. The characters are, that is. So if you've read this book or if you've played the game Star Trek Klingon, let me know your thoughts in the comments section down below. If you've done both, do you think it's a good adaptation, all that stuff? Let me know your thoughts. If you like Star Trek books or really books of any kind, please subscribe to the channel because I do book reviews of all types of books. But until next time, I'm Jonathan, and thank you for watching.